the Lord addressed Job out of the storm. Storms, clouds, winds feature prominently, actually, in the theology and in the religious experience of the Hebrew people, the Israelites. Job was addressed by God after chapters and chapters of lament and complaint and silence, apparently, from God. Job, of course, you know, is a long poem, chapters-long poem, very high literature, in which the friends of Job who have come to comfort him do very little of the comfort thing and mostly criticize him for some unknown fault. They say, you must have sinned because you're suffering. You must have done something. Examine yourself. Find out what it is. And Job keeps complaining, I haven't done anything. I've been righteous, and yet I suffer unjustly. And God is silent through all of this. Finally, God addresses Job out of the storm. Storms are understood by the Israelites as great marvels of God's power. And so they reveal to us, in a certain sense, who God is, in that such a great work, such a great power comes from one who must have power over that great power. For 4 chapters at the end of the book of Job, God addresses Job out of the storm. And he goes through a whole litany of great works that he's done. And he challenges Job. He says, you've been challenging me. You've been telling me that you are just and that you don't deserve this punishment. You don't deserve this suffering. He says, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst forth from the womb, and said, thus far shall you come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed? Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place? Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble and for the day of battle and war? Who cleft a channel for the torrents of rain and a way for the thunderbolt? Can you lift up your voice to the clouds that a flood of waters may cover you? Can you hunt the prey for the lion? He goes on and on and on, the great marvels of the natural world. And his point is that he is the master of them all. And we are not. This was demonstrated to us, to many of us, in this congregation just yesterday. In fact, when I walked into the church to get ready to help distribute Holy Communion at last evening's Mass, Father Mulini had the Mass, and people might have thought he was ad-libbing his homily because it was about storms, and the whirlwind was among us. It was blowing open the doors and pushing those doors open and bringing leaves and all manner of things inside. The lights went out. Father had to say the Eucharistic prayer by candlelight and by the skylight above him, which, thanks be to God, although there was a storm, it was not dark outside. It was marvelous, really. And I walked in the church and I'm laughing in the back of the church because I knew that Father had this all planned. No, he cannot command the winds. He cannot command the storm. And yet, there is a certain sense in which God's providence was present even there. God takes care of his people, as we see in the gospel today. As I say, storms feature prominently in the religious experience of the Hebrews, but storms are ambiguous, as so many of the natural elements are. Storms are ambiguous. We see here in the book of Job, God addressing Job out of the whirlwind. We see in another place, he invites Elijah to hear his voice. And Elijah goes up the mountain, and first comes the rain and the wind and the fire, and each time it says God was not in the rain. God was not in the wind. God was not in the fire. God was in the small, still voice that came after all of these great natural marvels. Jesus is asleep in the midst of the storm. And when he wakes, when the disciples wake him, he commands the storm to stop. So the storm is not God. And the storm is, in other words, all these natural elements, in other words, are God's servants. There's a great psalm that talks about the great marvels of the natural creation, and each of them it calls the great servants of God. It even says, there's a great line that we priests pray in our office, stormy winds who obey his word. You ever thought of it that way? Stormy winds obey God. They are part of his creation. They do his bidding. He ordered them. And this can come as a shock to us who have suffered damage from some of these natural elements. Perhaps even lost loved ones to great storms and natural disasters. And I'm not saying that natural disasters are good. Sin, when Adam and Eve sinned, they brought into this world a disordering of the way God had ordered it. Now, we don't know whether perhaps in the garden there were no tornadoes. But whether or not there were tornadoes, no one would have been hurt by them. Because the natural elements were created good by God. It's only through our sin that this natural world has suffered corruption. And we suffer the effects of that. The prophet Isaiah talks about a new creation in which, as you know, the famous passage, the lion will lie down with the lamb and there will be no harm or destruction on all my holy mountain. We look forward to that day. St. Paul talks about the creation groaning, waiting for the revelation of the glory of the sons of God. The creation, too, is waiting to be redeemed at the end of time. And we shall live, as St. John says in the book of Revelation, in a new creation, a new heavens and a new earth, where all is ordered in goodness, according to God's will. So how is it that we can still say, even now, that the natural elements are governed by divine providence? St. Paul says in another place that nothing can harm those who love God. All things work together for good for those who love God. Because for one who loves God, your heart isn't here on earth. Your heart is already in heaven. Your trust is in God who dwells in heaven. And this perhaps is the most important lesson we can learn from the natural elements. When we see them, when we see the grandeur and the glory and the beauty and the power of God's universe, we learn something about him because he's the one who made it that way. This is why we should go out to see the great things of God's creation. It's not an accident that in our day, with so much of our lives lived in air-conditioned, climate-controlled environments, indoors with electric lighting, air conditioning, radio and TV, we don't even have to leave. In fact, if you want to go somewhere, you get into your car without even going outside your house, many of you. We have ordered our worlds, but we are not powerful as God is. And so we have made our worlds very small. It's no accident that in this modern world, so many people have forgotten that God exists. Because they have closed him out. Quite literally. People have closed him out of their lives by this artificiality. And God made us to be tool makers and inventors and to discover things. I'm not saying that science and technology is a bad thing. I was a chemical engineer. But there's a danger in ordering our own environment according to our whims that we will forget the one who stands over it all. And storms like we had last night remind us of that. That no matter how powerful our technology and our science and our learning, we can never learn our way into heaven. You can't build a rocket strong enough to get you there. You can't jump high enough to jump into heaven. Because heaven is utterly other. God, who created this world and ordered it, remains transcendent. Utterly transcendent. I cannot force God to have a relationship with me. The universe depends upon him, but he does not depend upon the universe. God is not just the biggest creature in the universe. He's not just the strongest person. He's the one from whom power and strength and beauty and goodness come, from whom they all derive their names. He is goodness and beauty itself. He is power itself. And in seeing the great marvels of his creation, we see a glimpse of him. So I encourage you, as an exercise, especially as we enter the summertime, vacation, different kinds of activities, take a moment, take some time to go see the marvels of God's creation, to remind yourself, to allow him to remind you through these great things that he is the one above all of them. If you see a great waterfall and you're struck by its power or its beauty, know that he is more powerful and beautiful even than that. If you go out at night into the countryside and see the stars, he's the one who put them in their place. If you see a sunrise or a sunset that stirs you to love and admiration, he's the one who's causing that. Every morning he delights in his creation, and every evening he delights again. God, although, is not merely transcendent. If he were, we would have no access to him. We would long for him, but we wouldn't be able to find him. And this is the lesson, finally, of the gospel that we have. Because when the storm is around us, when these great natural elements are around us and they remind us of true power that is greater than ours, true beauty that we cannot create ourselves, God is asleep in the boat. He's with us in a certain way. Not because we have earned it or we have forced him to do so, but because he has willed to step into our lives. God is transcendent, true. But because of his will and his mercy, he's also what the theologians call immanent. If God is separate in transcendence, he's also with in immanence. He is more intimate to us than our very selves. The holy sacred authors write that he knows us better than we know ourselves. So don't ever fear that God doesn't hear you, or that you have no access to him, or that these great and beautiful things that God has given you are the end of his care for you. To demonstrate his immanence and his love, he remains with us always. Really present in the Holy Eucharist. Really willing to give himself not just as an external person or element or member, but to really become interior to us. And as the church fathers wrote, with this food, although with all other foods they turn into us, we turn them into ourselves, with this food, its power is greater than ours, and it transforms us into what it is. Jesus in the Holy Eucharist is turning us into himself, and someday we will see him face to face. This is our destiny and our calling. And this is how we know that despite all the difficulties, the harms that we suffer here on this earth, the sufferings that we may not have earned or merited, God still cares for us because he is utterly transcendent, the source of all power and beauty, but also the source of life, who wills the goodness of his creation, who maintains it in being, and who wills it to be joined to himself. My friends, seek him. Because sometimes he speaks in the great and powerful moments. Sometimes he speaks in the still small voice. Sometimes he's asleep in the boat. But he's present to us. And it's important for us to allow ourselves to hear his voice. Because we have, as I've said, closed ourselves off so greatly from that natural and supernatural voice of God with our self-contained worlds. Break out of your shells. Seek him, trust that you will find him, and then never let go. Praised be Jesus Christ, now and forever.